for this opening of the community lecture series. I'm Simon Bronner. I'm the Dean of the college, and it is my pleasure to be able to welcome you to this evening and to the whole series that will continue for the next 5 weeks. We have as a partner in this series the Washington County Campus Foundation, which also is instrumental in handing out over $200,000 in scholarships to our students. So this is indeed a timely topic, looked at from multiple perspectives, and I hope you will come back next week and the week after for this continuing series and be able to indeed learn from it and ask questions and indeed to interact with us. I also want to point out to you, if you're looking to come back to campus, that this theater is also the home of musical masters, and they are presenting Addams Family, including a midnight show. So keep coming back to our various events.
She can't hear you.
I
can't hear.
I'm afraid the speaker has the microphone.
Oh.
Yes, but I will speak loudly. Put on my best actors.
Would you like to take this?
Well, let me also tell you, looking ahead to the winter season, and you're definitely going to want to come out for good holiday cheer, that on December 2nd, the orchestra will be playing in the gym at 2 p.m. That is indeed on a Saturday. So I hope you'll all come out for that. And then in this theater on December 10th, we have the performance of the choir led by Dr. Peter Jabot. That's a wonderful event. So keep coming back. We also are already making plans in the spring for the Festival of Arts, which is also wonderful, and a special event that I'm announcing now for the first time, that for the political season, we're bringing Donna Brazil, who many of you know from CNN, and Anna Navarro Coast to the View, here in person to this theater. That will be April 9th. So I hope, again, you will engage in this as part of our mission to be a community-focused hometown university, your hometown university. And now it is my pleasure to introduce the organizer for this series. Maybe some of you had him for class, and that is Professor Dylan Bennett in Political Science, who will introduce tonight's speaker.
Welcome, everybody. It's great to see you. My name is Dylan Bennett. I'm a member of the Lecture and Fine Arts Committee that organized this year's Community Lecture Series. We're really happy to see you tonight. Our guest is happy to see so many of you. It's just a great crowd. We are delighted to bring Professor Andrey Ivanov from UW-Platteville with his presentation, Ukraine, the Bloodlands of Freedom. We will begin in just a moment, but a few moments to express our gratitude. I reiterate Dean Bronner's comments about the foundation. A big thank you goes out to the Washington County Campus Foundation for supporting the lecture series this year. The women and men who serve on the foundation's board are a vital link between the community and the university. The foundation, through the foundation, community support for local students adds up to what we understand to be $200,000, which is each year, which is the most amazing and beautiful thing. The foundation support this fall will pay for the dance performance that we will enjoy in November. so we extend our thanks to the Campus Foundation. A big thank you also goes out to a local group called the Friends of Matt Zillig. The Friends of Matt Zillig have supported this lecture series for 15 years. They do so in the memory of their friend, Matt Zillig, a man who tirelessly championed the importance of world travel and encountering diverse people in the world. The Friends of Matt Zillig are Mary Sue Zillig, Vernil and Bill Olson, Cheryl and Ron Leifer, Marilee and Don Booth, Barbara and Dan Robertson. Many of you know them. These individuals, supported in their efforts by dozens of friends in the area, have strengthened our community fabric. They have supported the lecture series with money, but more importantly, with food. The Friends of Matt Zillig have built a fine tradition. After the first lecture each fall, it's time to eat and drink together. So tonight, after Professor Ivanov's lecture, the Friends of Matt Zillig invite you to enjoy some delicious Ukrainian food and drink just outside these doors right here. And now, to our esteemed speaker, we warmly welcome Professor Andrey Ivanov from UW-Platteville. Professor Ivanov earned his PhD from Yale University in 2012. He specializes in the intellectual, cultural, and social history of Eastern Europe and the Russian Empire. Professor Ivanov has held research appointments at the University of Notre Dame, Boston College, the University of Chicago, and Harvard College. He is a prize-winning author. Professor Ivanov.
Thank you very much. I hope you can hear me. This is the first time that I'm speaking with two mics. I've never spoken with two mics, so I'm hoping that everything goes clearly and the transmission goes to all the sources that are managing the mics on me. So I teach Eastern European history, I teach Russian history, I teach global history at UW-Platteville. I am a historian, and I come from Ukraine. I was born there, I was raised there. In my late teens, I moved to the United States, and I have my education from the United States, but I don't forget about my roots, and so it's a special honor for me to talk about Ukrainian history today. And historical roots of the present crisis, the present war, are very deep, and we're going to explore them today. I'm going to talk about the Ukrainian struggle for independence, Ukrainians' journey to independence, which was a treacherous path. It was a path of suffering and despair. Geographically, the people of Ukraine found themselves situated in this triangle, a triangle of doom which is known as the Bloodlands. You may have heard about the Bloodlands, and you may have seen the map of the Bloodlands, which is a territory roughly that's in Eastern Europe, and it's defined by northern boundary at the Baltic Sea, the southern boundary at the Black Sea, and the western boundary at the Rhine River. That is a very important triangle in global history, because in World War II, half of all deaths that took place in that war took place in that triangle, in the Bloodlands. And so Ukraine was actually at the heart of the Bloodlands. This is the area where genocide, wars, and great powers competition had wreaked havoc upon the people of this fertile and fructuous land. So this talk will detail the focal points of Ukraine's 400-year struggle for independence. It's a story of survival, it's a story of fight, it's a story of birth as a nation in 1648 and independence in 1991. I will talk about sacrifices, failures, and triumphs that all these key events had involved. And I think if there's a lesson that should be derived from this talk, it's a lesson about the global history, the global story of humankind's pursuit of dignity. For societies insulated by a blessed geography, Ukraine offers a lesson that freedom comes with a harrowing and often a Herculean cost. So let's look at the origins of Ukraine's fight for independence. So the origins of Ukrainian statehood actually go back to the European Reformation. When we think about European Reformation, we don't actually think much about Eastern Europe, right? We think about October 31st, which is Reformation Day, celebrated in many countries around the world. And on October 31st, 1517, what happened? Well, Martin Luther nailed some theses on a door in Wittenberg. What very few people realize is that the first political entity to embrace Lutheranism as a state religion was a fiefdom of Poland. That was Duchy of Prussia, which was fiefdom of Poland. You could see that here in the north, no, right here, the Duchy of Prussia. So it was the first kind of Lutheran country or state entity in the world, but by the end of the 16th century, about half of Polish nobles and Polish noble parliament, the same, was Protestant. So Protestant Reformation spread a lot in Poland, and with Protestant Reformation came also the Counter-Reformation. And Counter-Reformation affected not only the Protestants, it also affected the Orthodox. And who were the Orthodox? Well, they're shown here in green, and the descendants of the ancient state of Rus, the ancient state of Kievan Rus over here, were Ukrainians and Belarusians, and they lived in the Duchy of Poland of Lithuania because the state of Rus essentially was destroyed by the Mongol invasion in the 13th century. So after the Mongol invasion destroys the Russian principalities, the areas that are west here become slowly amalgamated into Lithuanian and Polish state. And so the Eastern Slavic Orthodox people here lived on what was known as the frontier or the borderland of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. And the East Slavic word for borderland is Ukraina, or Ukraine. So after a couple of centuries, the Poles and the Lithuanians and then others, including Ukrainians themselves, started calling their land Ukraine and themselves Ukrainians, the people of the borderland. But for a couple of hundred years, the Eastern Orthodox Slavs lived very peacefully, coexisted very peacefully with Polish Catholics until the Counter-Reformation. And what happened with the Counter-Reformation is that the renewed Polish Catholic Church had proceeded with reconverting the Protestant nobles in Poland back to Catholicism. But as they were doing this, they were also seeking to bring the Orthodox Church under the jurisdiction of the Roman Catholic Church. And this happened in 1596 with the so-called Union of Brest. That was a church union where Ukrainian Orthodox dioceses were incorporated under the papal rule. And religious rights and freedoms of Orthodox Ukrainians were curtailed or completely abrogated. Even the holy city of Kiev was taken over by the Catholics, with the monasteries and the holy relics and the Metropolitan See. The last straw was the punitive campaign against the Ukrainian nobles who refused to convert to Catholicism. One of those nobles here was Bogdan Khmelnytsky, whose family estate and family church was overrun and taken away by Polish Catholics. Khmelnytsky tried to seek justice from the king, but the king told him to find his own justice. He couldn't help him. So he did. He was looking for his own justice. Khmelnytsky traveled to the wild fields of southern Ukraine, in Zaporizhia or Zaporozhye, a stateless area populated by Cossacks. Cossacks were free Ukrainian men who engaged in piracy, mercenary fighting, and free enterprise. They lived freely and they valued their freedom. They were also staunchly Orthodox. And here you have a painting of the Ukrainian Cossacks from the Chazen Museum of Art in Madison, which has actually quite an amazing collection of Ukrainian and Russian art. And so they were also raiding the territories of the Ottoman Empire, and they were known to write very insulting letters to the Turkish Sultan himself. So these Cossacks were really not going to bend under anyone's rule. They really valued freedom. When Khmelnytsky came to these Cossacks, he ignited the prairie fire that would spread all over Eastern Europe. And this fire was an all-out uprising against Polish rule. The Cossacks, led by Khmelnytsky, crushed the Polish army in one battle after another. The Orthodox peasants all over Ukraine had rebelled and revolted against their landlords. This large-scale peasant war, looks like I'm stuck here. Next slide. This large-scale peasant war was known as the Deluge in Polish history. Here it is, and here are the actual boundaries of the Deluge. That's how far west the Ukrainian peasant rebels and Cossacks had progressed in their fight for independence. This was the time when Poland was flooded with armies, angry peasants, and blood. In February of 1649, Khmelnytsky liberates the holy city of Kiev, the Orthodox city of ancient Rus, the most important city in Ukrainian Orthodox Church. He proclaims Ukrainian independence, and he proclaims full restoration of the rights of the Orthodox Church. Also, most importantly, he is proclaimed the hetman and the prince and the autocrat of Rus, of Ukraine. And the state that he proclaims becomes known as the hetmanate. And so he is the hetman, and all of the subsequent rulers of Ukraine in early modern history are also known as hetmans. Now, what is a hetman? Hetman is a supreme military ruler. The term hetman means literally generalissimus. It's kind of like the shogun in Japan. The shoguns had supreme military power, but they also wielded political power, and this is what hetmans in Ukrainian history have done as well. But Khmelnytsky had a problem. He could hold off the Polish army for a while, but he could not hold them off for long, because Poland had an organized professional army, and Ukrainian army was composed of Cossacks and angry peasants. And angry peasants cannot hold against an organized army for very long. And so this is where Khmelnytsky decided to look for an ally, an external ally. He actually wrote to a ruler of Transylvania. He reached out to Hungary. He reached out to Sweden. Sweden agreed to invade Poland, and Sweden did invade Poland, and they looted the treasures of Poland, but that seemed to be pretty much the only thing that Swedes were interested in. And if you go to Stockholm today, there are actually museums that are still stuffed with Polish treasures that they looted during this war. So Sweden was interested in looting, but it was not interested in helping Ukraine and Ukrainian independence. The only neighbor that was willing to help was Muscovy, which would later become known as Russia. And Muscovy, the Muscovite Tsar, the Tsar of Moscow, had offered his armies to Ukrainian hetmanate in exchange for Ukrainian nobles and Cossacks proclaiming allegiance to the Tsar of Moscow. So the Tsar of Moscow would have to become the overlord, a kind of over the protectorate that Ukraine would become. Ukrainians were allowed to keep their Ukrainian state, their autonomy, but under the Tsar's protection and Tsar's sovereignty. So the Muscovite army entered the war against Poland, but the result was a long and brutal struggle that lasted until 1667 and ended in a stalemate. Borders between Poland and Moscow-ruled Ukrainian hetmanate were set at the Dnieper River, roughly over here. There was an exception of the city of Kiev, which would go to the hetmanate, and not to Poland, but the rest of Ukraine here stayed with the Polish state. So what happened is that the hetman of Ukraine lost about half of the territories that were originally liberated in the War of Independence. And so that meant that the stalemate was in a sense defeat, but it was something, at least something that Ukrainian state or hetmanate had received. The stalemate, however, was not the worst of it. In 1666, the Ottoman Empire, and if you look at the geography of Ukraine, south of Ukraine and south of Poland is the Turkish Empire, the Ottoman Empire. So Ukrainian people had to face the combined assault of Polish and Ottoman armies, which between 1666 and 1676 had ravaged the territories of Ukraine, especially the right bank Ukraine, but also the territories of Poland. And there was a lot of fighting that was involved. There was a lot of fighting that was linked to a civil war where a pro-Turkish hetman fought against the pro-Muscovite hetman. So here you have Hetman Doroshenko, who fought on the Ottoman side, again devastating local communities and killing and destroying everything in their way. So despite the Ottoman assault, the Eastern Ukrainian hetmanate, that is the hetmanate of the left bank of the Dnieper, had survived. According to the 1676 peace treaty, the hetmans were allowed to keep their autonomy on a stretch of land here along the eastern bank of the Dnieper River. The city of Kiev as well remained under the hetmanate control. And here you have the southern area known as Zaporizhia or Zaporozhia. This is where the Cossacks lived and had, these were mostly wild fields. They were not very populated, but the Cossacks had a lot of control here as well. So this was a compromise. It was a difficult compromise, but it was something. After 2 decades of fighting against Poland and against Turkey, Ukrainian hetmanate finally settled down. But the price that was paid in the course of the war of Ukrainian independence was enormous. Depopulation. Depopulation affected gravely Ukrainian state or Ukrainian lands. Before the war, the population of Ukrainian lands of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth was a little bit over 3 million. If you take all the territories of Ukraine, including those that were not part of Poland, the population was a little bit over 5 million people. 65% of that population was lost as a result of the war. You have a loss of 68% of all royally chartered towns and villages, 70% loss in some areas like Podolia, which is southwestern Ukraine. It was very close to the Ottoman possessions and Ottoman Empire, so a lot of devastation took place there. Regional losses. Volhynia saw the heartland of fighting, both against Poland and against the Ottoman Empire, and compared to 1629 figures, you had 80 to 85% loss. The central area in the right bank Dnieper Ukraine, where the bulk of Turkish and Polish fighting had taken place here, lost about 90% of population. It was massive depopulation that Ukrainian lands had suffered. Urban areas. So here's the city of Lutsk, which is on the map. It's roughly over here, very western part of Ukraine. The city of Lutsk had registered 546 households in the census of 1629. By the start of the war in 1649, you have a decline to 409 households, then 182 households. And then by 1658, only 14 households were left in the city of Lutsk. It's a massive depopulation of a thriving urban center. Rural areas saw very terrible depopulation as well. You have Braslav district, which is close to Podolia, close to the Ottoman Empire. The reduction of households in the rural areas from 71,000 to roughly 6,000 over the course of the war. You had massive movement of population. People moved in different areas, but mostly they moved out east because the eastern Ukraine, beyond the Dnieper River, was safer, But you also had the so-called Veliki Zhin, which was a forced movement when the eastern Ukrainian hetmanate would move the whole districts of population of people in the right bank Ukraine. That's the area that lost 90% of people. And they would move them to the left bank of Ukraine. In 1711, they moved 200,000 people. A lot of slaves were captured by the Ottomans as a result of these raids and so on. In 1655 alone, you had 200,000 people who were enslaved as a result of that raid or continuous raiding during that time period. So Ukrainian hetmanate functioned as a part of the Russian Empire for about 100 years, until 1764. During that century of Ukrainian statehood, the hetmanate developed its own laws, administration, military. Magdeburg charter rights were applied to several cities in that part of Ukraine. Official language was developed, university education, foreign relations were developed with countries other than Turkey and Poland. Cossacks even adopted their own constitution in 1710 and 1711. Ukraine, however, was slowly amalgamated into the Russian Empire. As Russian Empire started centralizing, they couldn't tolerate the existence of this entity known as the Hetmanate, which was not, fully under the control of the Russian Tsars. So after 1764, the Russian Empire fully amalgamated Ukrainian lands. And after the growth of the Austrian Empire, Ukrainian lands that were in the west were taken over by Austria. And in fact, it's a similar story of empire growth in Eastern Europe for Poland and Lithuania as well. In the 18th century, Poland and Lithuania also ceased to exist as nations, and they were taken over by the Russian Empire, the German Empire, and the Austrian Empire. And so by 1914, Ukrainians were living mostly in the Russian Empire, with about 1/3 of Ukraine as a part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Now these years, the memory of the Hetmanate had been preserved, and Ukrainian literature and language developed even further. This was the time of the development of Ukrainian national consciousness. Sometimes it developed clandestinely, sometimes not. Now the next chance for Ukrainian freedom would only come when the Russian Empire dissolved itself in the wake of World War I and the 1917 revolutions. The Tsar was overthrown. He was overthrown by kind of liberal, moderate socialist government that toppled the Tsar. And then these liberals who had overthrown the Tsar were overthrown themselves by more radical Bolsheviks. And so in 1917, Russia is in chaos. It's kind of like a colossal king of the hill game, where everybody's trying to get on top and take over. Russia was in chaos, in revolt, in collapse. And in the midst of Russian collapse, Ukrainian military officers, Ukrainian intellectuals, revolutionaries took power in Kiev and decided that this is the chance. The best course of action now is to proclaim independence, because Russia seems to have ceased to exist. It's not really out there anymore, and the best course of action is freedom. Ukrainian army units that were formerly part of the Russian Imperial Army during World War I now swore allegiance to a new state. This new state was proclaimed as Ukrainian National Republic. On the frosty but snowless morning of January 22nd, 1918, the revered academic scholar and historian of Ukraine, Mikhailo Hrushevsky, drafted this Declaration of Independence. Here is Hrushevsky, who was the first president of the Ukrainian National Republic, and here is the text of the declaration that proclaimed Ukraine's independence. And so it seemed like the new era, the new epoch had begun for Ukraine. Hrushevsky was supported by enthusiastic crowds, but more importantly, he was supported by the Ukrainian army officers who were determined to shed blood for freedom for their land. The Independence Declaration created a new country, a new state on the map of Europe, Ukrainian National Republic, and while there was much jubilation about the newfound freedom, the road to independence was again paid in blood and suffering. Freedom was not free. Internal disagreements raged as passionately as external threat. Ukraine's political, intellectual, and military elites were all divided as to what type of rule they should have. So that's why between January and April of 1918, Ukraine is ruled by the government that could be classified roughly as liberal democratic. That is kind of like similar to, some of them were moderate socialists, but it was similar to France or United States today. And that's what they wanted. That's the path that they wanted for Ukraine. However, a lot of Ukrainian military officers were not satisfied with this government, and with the help of Imperial Germany, a new government was proclaimed that brought in a monarchist, a conservative monarchist, to the throne of Ukraine. Pavlo Skoropadsky was proclaimed the Hetman of Ukraine. Pavlo Skoropadsky, by the way, was a descendant, a distant descendant of another Ukrainian hetman from the 18th century, Ivan Skoropadsky. So Skoropadsky thought that being a hetman, being a monarch of Ukraine, is something that should run in the family. It should be hereditary. So he introduced this kind of monarchist, conservative system that gave a lot of preference to military organization of Ukraine. Having said this, he was very organized and his state was very well organized, and they were able to accomplish a lot of feats during the few months that this hetmanate was ruling in Kiev, including the bringing of Crimea under Ukrainian rule. This is when Crimea was integrated into Ukrainian hetmanate, which originally it wasn't. It wasn't part of the Ukrainian National Republic, but under Skoropadsky, Crimea became a part of Ukrainian state. Now, as the German and Austrian sponsors or patrons of Skoropadsky lost the World War I, Ukrainian National Republic and the revolutionaries who supported it had overthrown the hetmanate and established a second Ukrainian National Republic, which is sometimes also known as the Directory government, which was led by a socialist, Volodymyr Vinnychenko, the prime minister of the Ukrainian National Republic. Now, Vinnychenko was a socialist, a real socialist, but he was not a Bolshevik. He actually should not be confused with Moscow's Bolsheviks, and in fact, he opposed them, and between 1918 and 1921, Ukrainian National Republic and Soviet Russia fought a long, hard war. But this was not the only war that Ukraine had fought between 1918 and 1921. Surrounded by enemies on all sides, Ukrainian National Republic had fought against pretty much everybody on its borders. So here in the north, you see the crazy Bolshevik trying to throw a bomb at Ukraine. Here on the right, you see the Russian nationalist army, known as the White Army. They were fighting against the Red Army, but the Russian nationalist White Army, some of them were monarchists, and they wanted to resurrect the Romanov dynasty and bring Ukraine under Romanov domination, but some of them were not monarchists. But they're shown here as kind of like the monarchists in this poster, this Ukrainian poster from 1918. And so they wanted to take over Ukraine as well. And here you have the Polish armies and the Romanian armies, each trying to take as many bits and pieces of Ukrainian territory as they can take. So as you could see, Ukrainian National Republic was in a very, very tough spot. Hard choices and difficult decisions had to be made. Of all the enemies surrounding Ukraine, Poland was the least threat to Ukraine's republic. So in 1919, Ukrainian Republic concluded an alliance with Poland, and the combined force of Ukrainian and Polish armies were able to march and liberate Kiev in May of 1920. Here you have the victory parade in Kiev with Ukrainian Polish soldiers marching along. This was a major achievement. It seemed like perhaps Ukraine could sustain itself and preserve its independence, even as an ally of Poland. As a side note, by the way, it is interesting to point out that Americans too played a role in this campaign to liberate Ukrainian lands from the Bolsheviks. The American volunteers, to be precise, the aviators of the Kostushko Squadron, led by the future creator of King Kong, Marion Cooper, right here on the left, provided aerial support and reconnaissance to Ukrainian troops during this march, this war in 1920. Unfortunately for Ukraine, this support was not enough. It was not enough to beat back the Bolsheviks. The Communist Red Army was led by a very skilled commander, Leon Trotsky. He defeated the armies of the National Republic and those of Poland, forcing Poland to sign a humiliating Treaty of Riga in 1921. This treaty no longer recognized Ukrainian independence. Instead, Kiev and the two-thirds of Ukraine would end up as a part of Soviet Union under the tutelage of Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic. The price that Ukrainians paid again in the course of struggle for freedom was horrendous. Freedom is not costless. The freedom that ends in disappointment and disenchantment also has an emotional toll. Was it all pointless? Was it all in vain? What were we fighting for? This is the questions that a lot of Ukrainian emigres in 1920s and 1930s, as they were sitting in Paris or sitting in New York or sitting in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, they were asking those questions, why we were fighting this. Was it all in vain? What happened? In the period between 1918 and 1921, Ukraine's losses demonstrate the toll of human suffering. You had roughly 400,000 military deaths and over 2 million civilian losses that happened to a population of about 30 million at the time. The Jewish population suffered enormously during the continuing and never-ending conflict that really started in 1917 and continued until 1921. Ukraine was not only the heartland of the Bloodlands, it was also the heartland of the Jewish population in Europe. This is where the majority of Ashkenazi Jews actually lived prior to the immigration to Israel. So here you have a map showing the percentage of Jewish population in different parts of Ukraine, Poland, Belarus, and Moldova. And in some areas you have of Ukraine, this is kind of the heartland of Ukraine, 14% plus of the population are Jewish, and some areas 17 plus. So that means that every sixth, every fifth, every seventh person on the street in most of the cities and towns in Ukraine would be Jewish. So that's a very, very large Jewish population. Now, deprived of basic rights under the Tsars, Jews were always an easy target for criminals, looters, and bandits who organized looting because it was a crime that would have no consequences. The Russian police, the Tsarist police, would not prosecute the looters or bandits who killed Jews or took away their property. So as a result, Jews were subject to these looting rages that were known as the pogroms. Pogrom, that's a Russian word, by the way. So pogroms raged all over this area of the Russian Empire. And in the now independent Ukraine, however, Jews acquired new freedoms and civil rights. They also received autonomy, and their language, Yiddish, was recognized on the currency of New Ukraine. And so here you have Ukrainian currency, and you have Yiddish right here. Now, one of the world's best-known Zionists, Volodymyr Zhabotinsky, who is featured here on Israeli 100-shekel bill, he was an ardent supporter of Ukrainian national cause. There were also Jewish officials and Bund, that is Jewish Bund party members, who affiliated themselves or allied themselves to the socialists of Vinnychenko and Petlura, and were part of that Ukrainian national government. Unfortunately, Ukrainian government was too unstable and weak to provide protection, and Jews suffered immensely at the hands of Russian anti-Semites, Ukrainian anti-Semites, and even the Bolsheviks. It is estimated that about 8% of all the pogroms that took place in this period were carried out by the Red Army. That's a small number, of course, not much, but it is not to say that there was no complicity at all. The results of these pogroms meant that 40,000 Jews, or roughly about 40,000 Jews, were dead during the pogroms themselves, and then another 70,000 died from the after effects, and roughly 600,000 Jews had emigrated to other areas, to Palestine, to United States, to Canada, Australia, and elsewhere. So the result of all of this suffering was not independence, but communist government. Ukraine was now Soviet Ukraine, it was part of Soviet Union, and the establishment of communist government in Ukraine did not bring much reprieve to its people. Although the war was over, yes, the active fighting and conflict phase was over, there were no armies, there were no military on the ground anymore, the communists launched a new war, a war on the Ukrainian people. The war resulted in hunger. Famines would strike Ukraine in early decades of Soviet government, terrible famines. You see, the Soviets' number one enemy was a Ukrainian farmer. Ukrainian peasant or farmer was not like an industrial factory worker, because industrial factory workers were not peasants, they were wage workers, they were working for a wage, and they were considered to be proletariat. Whereas the peasants or farmers owned something, and they wanted to own more. And they owned the means of production, and they owned their produce. And this was a problem for Lenin and Stalin, who wanted to build a socialist utopia based on the abolition of private property, especially based on the abolition of the ownership of land. Ukrainians, however, cherished their land ownership, something that was heretical to socialist ethos. So the communists launched several expropriation campaigns where they took away peasants' grain and sent this grain to the cities, because in the cities lived the proletariat, the real sort of class that was considered to be the ideal class of the Marxist hierarchy, social hierarchy. And so the proletariat was supposed to get all that grain that was expropriated from Ukrainian villages. That, together with the entire post-war deterioration and the socialist mismanagement of agriculture, led to massive famine in southern Ukraine. The first famine broke out right after the end of the war. So from 1921 to 1923, and it was mostly in southern Ukraine, where the bulk of fighting had taken place. You had post-war agricultural collapse, and you also had intensified expropriation policies. 7 million people were affected by the famine, about 2 million people died. You had soup kitchens set up by the American Relief Administration here in Odessa, and this is an image from Stanford University, from Hoover Archive. If there is a sort of a bright spot in this terrible story of suffering, it's that the American people, they were not indifferent to it. Herbert Hoover, led by Herbert Hoover, the American Relief Association delivered foodstuffs and built soup kitchens like the one you saw in Odessa in the earlier slide here. The full story of ARA's relief is something that really needs to be told, and I'm hoping that very soon there will be a researcher who will dig up the treasure trove of the Hoover archives in Stanford and will tell us more in the new monograph on this. But here are some posters from Hoover Institution about the American Relief Association helping the starving Ukrainians and starving Russians and many other peoples, Tatars, Crimean Tatars, and Jews and others who lived in that area. Now, the second famine took place in the early 1930s, when millions of Americans themselves were lining up soup kitchens in New York City, in St. Louis, and Detroit. There was no relief that would arrive, and no relief that Stalin would accept from the United States or anybody else. You see, the dictator was now leading Soviet Union through the process of the so-called collectivization. And what collectivization meant was that you have abolition of private property of land. That's the fulfillment of ideological utopia, right? You take away the property and you abolish the property. But what it meant in practice is that land was expropriated and now managed by essentially government officials or local officials who would become government officials, and landowners, the farmers themselves, would become wage workers for these collective farms. Or they would become workers that would get a share of the harvest at these collective farms and very little else. Now, Stalin's collectivization, and you see the enthusiastic poster of Soviet propaganda announcing the collectivization, this was announced in 1929. But by 1932, 3 years later, most of the land in Ukraine was still not collectivized. You see, in a lot of areas of Russia, like north, where you have very poor land, boggy land, marshy land, that you can't really grow generous harvests on, collectivization went more or less smoothly because some peasants weren't really that tied to their land. But in Ukraine, where you have topsoil and 2 harvests a year, the peasants wanted to keep their land. And so as much as Soviet government had pressed on them and pressed on them and pressed on them, from between 1929 and 1932, Ukrainians would not budge. They would not give up their land. And so in 1932, Stalin ordered Ukrainian Communist Party to finally solve this issue through expropriation and terror and artificial famine. This was done first through the quotas. The quotas that the Ukrainian peasants now had to supply to Moscow. And the quotas were inflated on purpose. In some areas of Ukraine, the quotas were inflated 15 times. So if your annual harvest on your farm is 10 tons of grain, you now have to send 150 tons of grain to Moscow, or else you will be shot. Where would you get that grain? The communists expropriated everything. They took the grain, they took the seed grain, and they took the personal grain. They took everything. But of course, you still can't fulfill the quota that's inflated by 15 times. So the communist government allowed expropriation of other food as a substitute. So including meat. All personal food was strictly prohibited. People are not allowed to keep food at homes if they have jams, if they have reserves, if they have pigs or chickens, if they have ducks, everything was taken away. Everything was taken away. And so there was nothing left. Peasants were prohibited from gathering single grains from the field or potatoes from communal fields for personal consumption. Over 100,000 towers were set up in Ukrainian fields with guards watching people on empty fields and shooting them if they're trying to steal like a little potato that's left on the field. That's illegal. You can't take that potato. They literally put watchtowers on the empty fields of Ukraine. The result of this mass expropriation of food was starvation. By January of 1933, the communist government filled its quota, but villages were empty of food and empty of seed grain. Without seeds, there would be no harvest in 1933. There would be only one harvest in 1933, the harvest of despair. And without food left at home, some peasants started running. They would run to the cities, where they would just prostrate themselves and die on the streets as the proletarian workers, industrial workers were walking by and looking at the peasants dying in their midst. They would run to Poland to try to cross the borders and so on. Few journalists that were in Soviet Union documented it, but it was Soviet borders were sealed and Stalin wanted no word to get out to the rest of the world about what is going on, this artificial famine. Moreover, the government cracked down on peasant flight by prohibiting movement. The peasants were supposed to stay isolated within their homes, within their villages, and they were supposed to die from hunger. They were not supposed to flee. Those who entered the cities were arrested and sent back to their villages. Those who would dare to come to a hospital because they're dying from starvation, the doctors and the nurses were mandated to turn them away. Moreover, it was prohibited to feed the starving masses at the hospitals. People survived any way they could. We can all make judgment calls. But what would you do if you were prohibited to keep any food in your home? If the last jar of canned tomatoes or cucumbers or what else is taken away, what would you do? Cannibalism took place for sure. One of the most popular forms of cannibalism was a mother instructing her children to eat her after she dies. that took place, and that was a form of cannibalism that was more widespread than other forms. A mother telling her children. In the villages engulfed by famine, there was a very easy way to spot an act of cannibalism. In the winter, February, March 1933, people lived in their homes in villages, and obviously if chimney has smoke coming up and it smells like the smell of meat, you know that that house is not cooking a pig. And you know that that house is not cooking a chicken, because there are not any chickens. There are no chickens and no pigs in that village left. So that's how people recognize that, okay, somebody over there in that part of the village did that. Because they had the smoke coming out and the meat was smelled. As I speak now, I'm dealing with a personal loss. My grandfather passed away just a couple of days ago. And I remember as a child going to my grandfather's village in Ukraine, where he would show, in Dnipropetrovsk region, where he would show me the village. And I remember his mother, my great-grandma, would tell me, well, that's the house where that took place, and that's the house where that took place. And those people, some of them survived and kept on living, and had their careers, had their splendid rewards in the Communist Party and so on, but it did happen, and that's something that is a memory in every Ukrainian village affected by Holodomor, this famine. The result of the famine was exactly what Stalin wanted: full subjugation of Ukrainian people, total obedience. You see, the starving people, they will sign anything. If you have nothing left and you're dying from hunger, and they give you a piece of paper and say, give up your land and you will be part of the collective farm, sure, everybody will sign that. You had population loss as much as 60% here in the heartland of Ukraine, the right bank here and the left bank here. You had lesser deaths in other areas, and the closer to Poland you were, the better it was. There was a lot of flight to Poland that took place as well. But the famine left its mark on the memory and on the lives of Ukrainian people. The after effects of malnutrition persisted for a long time. The average life expectancy of a Ukrainian child born in 1933 was just 7 years. If you're born in 1933, your average life expectancy is 7 years. 3.4 million people perished. That's kind of more or less the statistic that most historians agree upon. There's also 4 million figure, but it's not easy to determine for sure how many millions of people perished. Outside from demographic studies and looking at the statistics, the population before and population after and so on, but it's very hard to determine exactly how many people perished. But between 3 and 4 million, that would be a pretty accurate figure. Now, if the famine was not enough, the next calamity to befall Ukraine was World War II. The Holocaust, which was part of World War II, wiped out Jewish population in some areas of Ukraine and reduced it in others. The Holocaust took place in 3 stages. There was the Holocaust in the ghettos, that is the Holocaust by starvation. And then when Jews were not dying quick enough for Hitler, then came the Holocaust by the bullet, when you had SS soldiers essentially shooting the Jewish civilians and killing them in the killing fields of Poland, Ukraine, Belarus, and Western Russia, and the Baltics too. But when the Jews were not dying fast enough for Hitler from the Holocaust by the bullets, came the gas chambers, the industrialized, the mechanized way to kill. And so you had the 3rd stage of the Holocaust by the gas chambers. One of the most infamous instances of Holocaust took place in Ukraine, in the city of Kiev, which was taken over by the Nazis in August of 1941. In September of 1941, they established civilian administration. And the massacre was carried out by the SS, where some 34,000 Jews were murdered in the ravine known as Babi Yar. Now, what originally happened is that because Soviet society was more or less isolated, informationally, or there were hardly any news coming from the West or elsewhere, a lot of Jews in Kiev didn't know what was going on. And in September of 1941, the German government put up a notice telling the Jewish people of Kiev to show up at a certain collection point with their belongings, where they would be transported to the West. And some Jews didn't know what that meant. Well, maybe we're going to a better place, away from the war in the front line, because the front line was moving east. And so you had a lot of Jews that showed up to these collection points, and then they were taken over group by group to a ravine outside of Kiev, and they were shot by the SS, the elite units of the Wehrmacht. So some 34,000 Jews were murdered here in fall of 1941, but overall you had about 100,000 people who died in the ravine that were shot during the German occupation of Kiev. Now, most Ukrainians resisted the Nazis, and they resisted the Nazis by joining the Red Army, being conscripted in the Red Armies. Roughly 6 million Ukrainians, 5 to 6 million Ukrainian soldiers fought on the Soviet side of the war effort. And you have here some other figures. The 2.5 million Ukrainians were decorated heroes. I should also say the man who plotted or planned the putting of flag on the Reichstag in 1945 was also Ukrainian. Here you have some posters in Ukrainian celebrating Ukrainian soldiers liberating Kiev here, and here's another liberator of Kiev. So you had 5 to 6 million Ukrainians who had fought in the ranks of the Red Army. Other Ukrainians, however, chose to resist both the Red Army and the Nazis. You see, in June of 1941, a lot of Ukrainians had welcomed Germans as liberators. You see, after Stalin and the famine, a lot of them thought, well, Hitler is going to give us the land back, and Hitler would restore the independence of Ukraine. Well, by October 1942, their hopes were dashed. Hitler did not reestablish the independence of Ukraine, and Hitler did not abolish the collective farms. He wanted Ukrainians to stay as slaves, providing grain for the Germans, just as they were earlier on the collective farms, slaves providing grain for Moscow. As a result of this disappointment in 1942, in October of 1942, Ukrainian national movement emerged, a resistance movement, an underground resistance movement that was known as UPA, Ukrainian Insurgent Army. As this poster demonstrates, Ukrainian insurgents were against Hitler, and they were also against Stalin. Some 100,000 Ukrainians went through the rank of the Ukrainian Insurgent Army in the course of its history. But they fought a battle that was unwinnable. Not only because so many other Ukrainians were fighting on the Soviet side, but also because the Allies were determined to defeat Hitler and not Stalin. In fact, the United States provided a lot of support to the Soviet war effort through Lend-Lease, and I'm sure you've heard about this. But what you may not have heard is that the Americans established 3 air bases in Ukraine during World War II. Serhiy Plokhy, a professor of Ukrainian history at Harvard, wrote a great book about history of American pilots in Ukraine in 1944 and 1945, and it is a fascinating read. Here you have an image of an American pilot in Poltava sharing something, maybe that's a toy, I don't know, with a Ukrainian child. You had literally American pilots in Ukraine who lived there and who regularly would use their bombers, here are American bombers next to Soviet bombers, to stage raids from Ukraine onto Warsaw and Berlin and Prague. And this was known as Operation Frantic, by the way. And what it meant is that you had the combination of bombers flying in from England, bombing Nazi Germany, and you also had the bombers flying in from Ukraine, dropping explosives on the Third Reich. It was a successful operation. And the Americans were determined to help Soviet Union and Soviet Ukrainian army. So it is one of the reasons why the Ukrainian insurgent army and its effort did not bring the results they wanted. So this brings me to a conclusion that should open the floor for further discussion. Ukraine's realization of full independence would finally come in 1991. But it happened without blood, and it happened without any human sacrifice. You see, Soviet Union started collapsing right around 1989 and was undergoing existential crisis. And Yeltsin here, the leader of the Russian Republic within Soviet Union, declared the sovereignty of Russia vis-a-vis Soviet Union. So now it seemed like Russia could actually leave Soviet Union. And in fact, this bizarre oddity happened in August of 1991 when the coup government of Soviet Union went to war against the government of Russia. Russia fighting Soviet Union. I mean, that seemed impossible, but on the streets of Moscow, the battles took place for 3 days in August of 1991. So in 1990, going back to 1990, after Russia declares its own sovereignty vis-a-vis Soviet Union, Ukrainian parliament, which was mostly run by Ukrainian communists, but he also had a lot of independence as well, declared state sovereignty as well. And here's a stamp commemorating, USSR stamp actually, commemorating the state sovereignty of Ukraine. And then after the coup happened, Ukraine declared its independence on 24th of August, 1991. And so Yeltsin's daring act would inspire others, including Ukrainian communists. Ukraine declared independence, yet unlike in 1649, unlike in 1918, nothing happened when Ukrainian independence was proclaimed. You see, when Ukraine proclaimed its independence in 1649 or 1918, there was a flood of fighting and conflict and so on. But in 91, there was no war, no invasion, not even threats from the neighbors, especially Russia. The Yeltsin government was among the first to recognize the independence of Ukraine, December 2nd. Russia and Ukrainian relations developed as partnership. Russia vowed to respect Ukraine's borders and sovereignty. Ukraine, in turn, provided lease to a number of ports and territories in Crimea for the Russian Black Sea Fleet. Can you imagine this? Ukraine had allowed generously Russian troops and Russian army, tens of thousands of soldiers, I believe it's 40,000, but I may be wrong about the final count, that were allowed to stay in Crimea. And Russia could lease Crimean territories for the Black Sea Fleet. Russia respected Ukraine's sovereignty, Ukraine's borders. The two most populous republics in USSR had gone through a peaceful and uneventful divorce, with Yeltsin and Kravchuk drinking bubbly and celebrating, while Gorbachev, fortunately or unfortunately, going into the dustbin of history on December 25th, 1991. Ukraine was now free, but was it too early to celebrate? This is what a lot of people in Ukraine are asking now. 91, it seemed so easy to get freedom, but is freedom easy? Is it easy to get freedom, to get independence? And as the case of Ukraine has shown in its history, because of its location and its geography, freedom always has a price. And it is a very, very difficult price. And so something went wrong between 1991 and 2014, and that is what we're living through today. We can talk about what went wrong in the Q&A session. Ukrainians are learning again the price of freedom. They're fighting for the freedom, for the independence that they got kind of so easy in 1991, and it seemed too real to be true, and it was too real to be true. Turns out that even after independence, freedom has to be earned, and it has to be earned in blood. Thank you very much for your attention. I'm very happy to be here. So I'm opening the floor to questions. I don't know if we have a moderator or the procedure, but do we have a mic for anybody who wants to ask a question, or I can just hear people? Yeah, just.
You talk about the abrogation of the, I forget the name of the treaty where Russia as a sovereign nation, and the United States pledged using force to protect the sovereignty of Ukraine when they gave up their nuclear devices.
Yeah, so this was 94 Budapest Memorandum. So what happened after the collapse of Soviet Union is that military installations with nuclear missiles were left on the territories of Ukraine, Belarus, and Kazakhstan. And Bill Clinton was determined to have those weapons shipped to Moscow, to Russia, I should say, so that they are under the control of Moscow. So what happened in 1991, when Yeltsin and Ukraine and other republics of Soviet Union signed the so-called Almaty Declaration. Part of that declaration involved everybody else giving up their control of nuclear weapons. So at the end of 1991, as a part of the deal of the collapse of Soviet Union, all of the republics of Soviet Union had to give the control, that is the keys or the codes, to their nuclear missiles to Moscow. That was in 91. But a few years later, after, Yeltsin realized, not Yeltsin, Bill Clinton realized that, well, there's so many of these nuclear weapons and they're under control of Russia, but they're not in Russia. What is going to happen to them? What about Gaddafi, who kept asking, supposedly kept asking Kazakhstan for nuclear weapons, right? And was offering a very generous sum for them. So what about Gaddafi? What about Saddam Hussein? What about others? And so as a result of that, Ukraine really had no choice because of several reasons. Because of the Almaty Declaration in 1991, Ukraine pledged that it would not control nuclear weapons, it would be nuclear free, and it also pledged to give up nuclear weapons in the Budapest Memorandum. There was a language in Budapest Memorandum that United States, Britain, and Russia would guarantee Ukraine's sovereignty and security, but how enforceable is that document now is a very big question. So we see that essentially Russia had violated its own memorandum that it signed, but it's not the first time that a Russian leader violates an agreement that was signed by a previous leader before. And so yes, there was the Budapest Memorandum, and Russia was supposed to respect the sovereignty of Ukraine in exchange of Ukraine giving up its weapons. But you know how that ended up. Yep. Yeah.
In 2014, that's when Russia took Crimea.
Mm-hmm.
Did America do anything? And if not, was it because we were so involved with Iraq
Mm-hmm.
and Afghanistan? And had things been different if we had help as we are doing?
Yeah. That's a great question. So in 2014, some sanctions were imposed on Russia. And these sanctions included the prohibition on sort of a number of Western businesses and banking establishments from doing business in Crimea. So it meant that if Moscow had McDonald's, Crimea did not have one. So what it meant is that the sanctions were limited only to Crimea. They were not really applicable to Russia as a whole, and there were some, from what I understand, there were some limited sanctions that were applied, but most of the sanctions that took place were only taking place in Crimea. And that is why from 2014 and until today, the Visa and MasterCard do not work in Crimea. But let's say, before the 2022, you could use your Visa or MasterCard in Moscow and St. Petersburg because there were no sanctions against the Russian financial institutions. So 2014 response is seen widely as a soft response. What could have been done differently? That's a counterfactual question. So I'm a historian, I'm not a political scientist, so that's something I should clarify. So historians don't like counterfactuals. It's like, what if Hitler was shot in 1923? Because there was a bullet that almost missed Hitler. When he was at that beer hall in Löwenbräu beer hall in Munich, drinking beer and staging riot, right? And there was a bullet that almost missed Hitler. What if it didn't miss Hitler? What would have happened? So as a historian, it's very hard for me to think in those terms. So what would have happened if yes, there was a stronger response to 2014, maybe Russia would have negotiated a withdrawal from Crimea, or maybe Russia would have doubled down. That's a possibility, yeah. Oh, yes.
I look at the landmass of Russia, and it's gigantic, and we know they're big oil producers. And then you have all those breakaway countries. Was the wealth of Russia actually in a lot of those breakaway countries? We know Ukraine produces is the food basket, the wheat and all. Is that true of most of their breakaway countries?
No. In fact, the majority of republics in Central Asia, but also Moldova and Belarus, were always subsidized by Russia itself. So I don't know if I have a wider map. I don't think I have a wider map. But for example, Armenia, which is way south here, doesn't have very many resources. They have some gold. They have a gold mine, a very prominent one. But unlike Russia, they don't have all that oil and gas and uranium, and the whole Mendeleev's table is in Russia. So Russia, as one of the reasons why Yeltsin wanted Russia to separate from Soviet Union, is because a lot of Russians were tired of subsidizing the poor republics of Soviet Union. So that was one of the discourses that was in the air in 1990 and 1991. The Russians were upset, why do we need this Soviet Union and we have to pay Tajikistan and Armenia to support themselves? They don't really contribute anything. They don't have any natural resources. So if we separate, then Russia will become the Dubai of the world, right? With all that oil and gas and all those riches and agriculture. Russia has a lot more fertile land than Ukraine does. So as far as Ukraine is concerned, Ukraine has just really unbound agricultural wealth. Very good climate that allows for 2 harvests. It's like Kansas, but a lot bigger, with plenty of moisture too, or enough moisture, I should say, as a result also of good irrigation practices and the Dnieper River that provided a lot of moisture in these areas in the south here. But Ukraine also has coal in the Donbass. In fact, the Donbass here, if I'm not mistaken, has the largest deposits of anthracite in Europe. Now, if you think about coal, there's coal and there's coal, but anthracite is the best type of coal. It has the most sort of packed carbonaceous byproduct that comes out in coke. So when you do the coking and you want to make steel, right? Like if you go to Gary, Indiana, a lot of these steel plants there. If you want to make steel, industrial grade steel, you got to have coke, good coke. And in order to get coke, you got to have anthracite. And not every coal is anthracite. It's kind of hard to find anthracite. And so the Donbass region here is the heartland of anthracite. And it really powered up Ukrainian steel production and industrial production for decades. And so Russia now controls Ukraine's coal deposits, and especially anthracite.
So it's more interested in Ukraine than all the other breakaway countries?
It is more interested in Ukraine, in my opinion, because of Putin's obsession with restoring the British Empire, the Russian Empire. Imagine if the Prime Minister of Britain was obsessed about restoring the British Empire. Where would they go first? I think Ireland. I think if Britain wanted to restore the British Empire, the first country they would attack brutally and mercilessly would be Ireland, because that's part of their identity. They'd say, oh, those people in Ireland, they speak English too, so let's, you know what I mean? This is why, Putin's strategy, it is so deranged. He really is interested in restoring the empire, and part of that restoration of empire is the land of Ukraine, which is rich land, it has a lot of resources, but it also speaks to the old glories. You have Crimea, you have the Crimean War and World War I and World War II, and there's a lot of myths and legends. And Putin doesn't get it that the time has moved on. And yes, Ireland speaks English and they drink tea that kind of tastes, Irish breakfast tea kind of tastes similar to English breakfast tea, but people have moved on. And Ireland is not part of Britain anymore. So Putin did not get that message. And he thinks that he could play 19th century annexationist games by restoring the glory of old Russian Empire. It's not even Soviet Union, it's the empire, in my opinion. Yes?
It appears from your presentation that there's been a progression of war after war after war after war.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Now, looking back at Afghanistan, you were involved in a 20-year war.
Mm-hmm.
It also does not appear self-evident that Ukraine will ever be eligible for the United Nations. So it seems like we're, as a nation, getting involved to carry a preponderance of the expense for Ukraine to sustain war after war after war, which could be never ending for another 20, 40 years.
So you're saying that Ukrainian war could be never ending, like the Afghanistan war?
I'm saying 20-year factor.
20 years from now. I mean, that was a dire prediction. I mean, I don't have a crystal ball, but I mean, anything is possible. At this point, this war could last 20 years, or it could last 2 years, it could last another 2 weeks.
My concern is that Europe
Yep.
is not funding its own percentage to assist Ukraine.
Mm-hmm.
The United States seems to be carrying the majority of expenses now for war.
Majority of what?
Expenses.
For the military, yes, but not for the civilian infrastructure, refugees, and yeah. I mean, EU has done a lot more than United States. United States has welcomed about 285,000 Ukrainian refugees, which is a lot. That's generous. But Poland, for example, has taken about 9 million Ukrainian refugees. Yes?
So, you still have relatives there, and what do you get, or do you get any on-the-ground information from them? What do they feel? What do they think?
Mm-hmm. So most relatives that I have left now. Even before or now, I've traveled to Krakow, Poland 5 times last year. And I brought some relatives and family members here to Wisconsin. I have some distant relatives still left, and the situation, they are in Kyiv, they are in the capital city. The situation has stabilized in a sense that people are living with daily attacks or near daily attacks. You have the drones and you have the missiles flying in, but people are now used to, if you have a siren, they just go into the basement. And then the siren stops and people go about their lives. And then they go out and do their things, and there's a siren, and people hide. And then what it seems to me is that the city of Kyiv is very well protected. The anti-aircraft or the air support is very good. This is probably the Patriot missiles, the U.S. aerial defenses. So the city itself is pretty well protected from Russian assault. It's not 100% proof, but it is better than other areas of Ukraine. And in other areas of Ukraine, like for example south here in Zaporizhia and Mykolaiv, where you have the proximity of the front lines, the Russians are able to launch not only the missiles, which kind of are launched from far away, but they could also launch some long-range artillery on the cities here. And so the situation over here is really a catastrophe. And I've met a lot of Ukrainians from the southern part here in Poland. And I've met a lot of them who just, I've met a professor from Mariupol, and she was a professor at the university. The university obviously was destroyed, so when she was leaving with her husband to go north, her husband stayed because he would fight in the armed forces of Ukraine. But she left with her 2 children that were with her, and they left outside of Mariupol, and they went to like a home of her mother-in-law, her husband's mother, and they were in that home, and then they kind of walked out. She and her husband walked out with children and her mother-in-law in the house, and the missile, or I should say, the artillery shell struck the house, and their kids died on their hands. And so that's what it means to live close to the front line. If you live close to the front line, it's not just missiles and drones. Kyiv has only missiles and drones. Areas here, civilian life is hell. So that's what I hear, yeah.
One last question, please,
Yeah.
and then we'll go have some food.
Yes, I don't, well,
I was going to say, when you see the fighting in Ukraine today, Ukraine,
Mhm.
and you see the huge Russian military and things like that. What is it about the Ukrainian people that continues to keep them so courageous and so brave to
Mhm.
continue to fight? And I know the freedom, I guess. Is
Yeah,
what you said.
it's in the genes. And after so many centuries, this is something that, they don't just want to roll over and say, okay, well, take over our land. Ukrainians have a very special relationship to land. It's originally agricultural, we Ukrainians are an agricultural people because we lived in this area that produced so much bounty. I mean, some of the watermelons here in Kherson would beat any Georgia watermelon you find in the store. I mean, they're big, they're so tasty. And there's just like so much, so much bounty. And so they're tied to this land. And so the feeling is, I've asked some people who say, well, why did you come to Poland, but your parents or somebody else didn't come out? And they say, well, they're tied to the land. Like, this is my land. If I was born here, I will die here. And I will not go to Poland. And of course, I tell them, tell your relatives, it's a bad decision. Your land will be back. Just come to Poland now, wait it out, because staying in those frontline areas is very dangerous for the civilians. It's an area for the military operations, not for the civilians. But yes, civilians are still there. Even in Bakhmut, civilians are there. They're tied to this is my home, and they wouldn't budge. Yeah. Thank you so much. I really appreciate you coming here.